Hello and welcome back to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today we're going to explore the extraordinary transatlantic clash over Greenland, which is threatening to tear NATO apart and escalate the trade war between the United States and what we used to think of as its European allies. You couldn't make this stuff up. Not even the authors of Borgen, the Danish political thriller series that became a worldwide hit, imagined a scenario in which a US president would demand possession of Greenland, a sparsely populated autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a loyal NATO ally, and threaten military action to get his way and punitive tariffs on European allies that support the Danes. Yet here we are. European NATO allies are promising to jointly beef up Arctic security in an attempt to address Washington's professed concerns about Russian and Chinese naval activity around Greenland, although, to be honest, no such activity has been spotted by Western intelligence services. Denmark has made clear that the US is entitled under their existing 1951 treaty to deploy more forces and build up bases in Greenland as it feels the need. But Donald Trump wants nothing less than, and I quote, complete and total control, by compulsory purchase if possible, but he won't rule out using force. Trump has branded the small European military reconnaissance mission sent to Greenland in support of Denmark last week a dangerous game, and is threatening to raise tariffs on imports from those European countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany and Norway, that participated. Well, what's really at stake here, and how much worse can it get? Could this be, as the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has warned, the end of NATO? Or is this the moment when Trump finally overreaches and is forced to back down, either by his own Republican-dominated Congress or by US public opinion, or by a robust and united European response, countermeasures? How should European NATO allies and the EU respond? And what are the implications for Ukraine's struggle against Russia's war of aggression? It's incredible to think that a spat about Greenland could have such far-reaching geopolitical consequences. But with Donald Trump, the unthinkable has become the new normal. Joining me to discuss what is behind the US demands and how Europeans should respond are Peter Fibiger, Professor of History at the University of Copenhagen's Saxo Institute, and my colleague Maria Martisiute, Policy Analyst in the EPC's Europe in the World programme, a former NATO and EU official, and leader of our Northern European platform, which groups some 20 think tanks from the Nordic and Baltic region. Welcome to you both. Peter, you and your colleague Rasmus Mariager published a striking discussion paper last week with the EPC entitled The Great Game of the Arctic, Denmark, Greenland and the US Empire, in which you describe the relationship between Copenhagen and Washington as that of a subject ally and an imperial metropole. How on earth did we get here, and what do you think is Trump's endgame?
Well, I guess part of the point in the article, right, is that actually we have already, well, not always, but at least since World War II, we have actually been right there. But we just have a different language for this. This has been one of the genius strikes of genius of the Americans, that they have sort of disguised their empire under the language of nationalism and sovereignty and self-determination of peoples and so on. But in fact, right from the very beginning, it is clear that America is establishing a kind of supremacy. Let me just, every time it happens, we get a little bit shocked, right? But they have done it for real before. One of the most striking episodes is the Suez Crisis, where General Nasser confiscates or nationalizes the Suez Canal. France and Britain and the Israelis send in a force to prevent all this from happening, and they are not in any kind of military trouble. But unfortunately, well, I don't know unfortunately, but the fact is that Britain owes a lot of money to the US. So all it takes for the US is to explain to Britain that unless they want to see their credit collapse, then they will have to withdraw. So America has asserted its supremacy over Europe since World War II every now and again. Most of the time it has not had to. Why? Because there was an even more threatening empire on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And one of the sort of big miracles, and almost something which we are completely unprepared to think in the way we think about empire, is that one of the great strengths of the American empire in Europe, not everywhere else, but in Europe, was that actually the nations of Eastern Europe have been flocking to join the empire, as it were. They want to be under that empire instead of the other one, right? That's Putin's big sort of headache, as it were. That blast it, I want to rebuild Russia, but yet they still just don't want us. They want the Americans. So in that respect, we have not been used to thinking about this, right? But the fact is that America is an empire, and sometimes it will exercise its supremacy.
So fair enough, you're describing this as a kind of benign disguised imperialism, but clearly Trump has removed the benign, removed the disguise, and he wants more territory. What do you think his end game is?
Well, the thing is that actually this is a gamble, if you ask me, right? It's also, as we point out in that article, and many other people have, all the things that are actually used to justify this action, America already has. So whether it's simply, I sort of hesitate to say, is it really just vanity? That was actually today, if you noticed, where we also mentioned the Chagos Island base held jointly by Britain and the US. We mentioned that last week already, and we have been talking about this actually, me and Rasmus, for the last year at least. That actually we thought there was a connection between Greenland and the Chagos Island, and basically, as I don't know whether it happened this morning or last night, I don't know, but basically Trump just made the connection direct between the Chagos Island base in the Indian Ocean and the agreement between the British government. I'm not sure it has been effectuated yet, right? But the agreement with Mauritius to hand it over to Mauritius. And that has been considered completely unacceptable by the American security establishment. And Denmark has also made an agreement with Greenland. Not that I think no one really expects this to happen anytime within the foreseeable future. So we're talking decades out in the future. But if Greenland wants its independence, it can have it. So far, it hasn't wanted it. But of course, there's lots of talk about independence on Greenland, and some people wish it, obviously. But it hasn't been effectuated, all these sorts of things yet. But there's I think that actually if there is any kind of security concern under these things, these two cases go together.
Is the survival of NATO, do you think, really at stake here? And what can Denmark do to defend its interests and avoid a shattering humiliation at the hands of its most important ally? Denmark, despite all these American threats, has gone on buying F-35s. Is this appeasement? Is this absolutely denial of the relationship with the US?
I think actually there is some logic in denial here, right? Because if you are going to be really cynical, I don't think, or rather just realistic, there is no big desire in the MAGA movement even, or in the US population as such, for this move, right? So this is something which is promoted by more narrow interest in America. Maybe it's Trump's vanity. Maybe it's also some of these business people that he's have sort of dreams about creating a free republic somewhere on Greenland or whatever. All these sorts of things that we have heard rumors about, right? But we can't quite know precisely what drives all this. But I don't think that there's a deep support in American society for this. So one of the best cards Denmark can play is to appeal to its European allies, try to stand sort of firm without escalating things, and then also show to the American public that we are basically here for you. We want to help and address all these concerns.
Well, what about that F-35 contract? Might it make sense for Denmark to say to the United States, well, look, if you want us to stick to our end of the F-35 contract, you stick to your end of the treaty on...
Question you're asking there, because, I don't know what the Air Force would say to this. The trouble is that we have seemed to have we've actually just right now retired our last F-16s. Half of it has been given to Ukraine and the other half sold to Argentina. So at the moment, we only have the F-35s, if I understand it correct, that we've already bought. Yeah, I'm not really sure that by cancelling that deal that we would impress the Americans very much in the long run. I think actually it's probably better to hold on to it.
Well, Maria, let me turn to you. You wrote in a commentary for the EPC last week that Europe can still articulate a credible vision for Greenland and the European Arctic to defuse this crisis. Obviously, a week is a long time in politics, as Harold Wilson famously said. What do you think Europe can do now to change Trump's course? What could NATO and Europe be doing differently about Arctic security, in your view?
Thank you, Paul, and such a pleasure to meet you and commence with you, Peter, as well. Well, indeed, I think Europe short-term needs to push back and to call out Trump's threats and claims as absurd, illegal, and dangerous. Now, European Union has been present in Greenland for some time. EU has an office in Nuuk. EU and Greenland have a cooperation agreement where between 2021 and 2027, EU is deploying about 300 million euros, which goes into education and skills. It goes into clean energy, green and digital transition. But this is not big money. And if you want to treat Greenland strategically, you have to beef up the amounts of money and also attract private investment. This can be done across a number of areas. So, for example, investments in the extraction of critical raw materials. Why is it the case that there are only 2 operational mines in Greenland? Why are we not trying to open another one with a view to, increasing employment and showing US added value? Another one is satellite security, which is also what the US is very keen about. So we do have startups now constructing a new ground station in order to protect against the, foreign signal interference, for example. Then hydropower. About 70% of Greenland's public energy is coming from hydropower, and there's untapped potential there. So I think we could significantly put a bigger package of investment coming from public and private money for Greenland. Now, the way to stand up to Trump is, of course, to push back. And I believe the EU will be putting a package of retaliation measures because we really have not been behaving in a strategic way up until now. We've been appeasing Trump. And this, I think, only feeds his aggressive tactics towards Europe. And we cannot afford another failure in EU's neighborhood. We already failed in Western Balkans. In the south, we already failed Ukraine, which is in the east. And now it seems that we are failing in the north. So we cannot afford that as Europe as a whole. And finally, defense and security. EU is building European defense industrial technological base. The European Arctic, including Greenland, has to absolutely be part of it. So I would like to see also projects materializing in that regard in order to integrate Greenland into this ecosystem.
Hard to imagine European arms factories in Greenland, but I think that when I looked into Arctic security, Greenland is a particularly difficult place to operate for any international company. And to extract minerals profitably has defeated most of the people who've tried. There was Chinese interest at one stage, and the Danish government, along with the US government, sort of combined to push that back when the Chinese wanted to invest in airports in Greenland. But getting either American or European companies to invest in Greenland has proved to be very difficult. So we'll have to see whether the contested nature now of Greenland will make it more or less attractive to outsiders to invest in. The Europeans, as you said, have accepted several humiliations from Trump in the last year over NATO defense spending and trade last year, just to keep the US engaged on Ukraine's side in European security. But that hasn't really been very successful. Is it now time for Europe to get tough? Should the EU be preparing retaliatory economic measures? Should Denmark, for example, invoke the NATO Treaty's Article 4 and demand consultations on a threat to its security? What do you think, Maria?
Thanks, Paul. I think all options should be on the table and we should be prepared for worst case scenarios. So I believe it's never too early and it's never too late to act. It is absolutely imperative for the EU to put a package of retaliatory measures. I'm hearing that already the 93 billion, which were prepared last year, in the wake of EU-US trade deal, is now being reactivated, perhaps even increased. There are discussions, whether to potentially activate the anti-coercion instrument, which is, can result in a broad range of tools in terms of limiting American companies to access EU internal market, in terms of limiting foreign direct investment, or export controls and other restrictions on goods and services. I think we should absolutely prepare these scenarios in case Trump doesn't back down. That means also that we need to be prepared to deploy them in case Trump tries to call this a bluff. So we need to be able to assume the risks that might potentially come with this, with the extra cost for our economy, with extra costs for our populations. But I believe that the political military risks are just too high. And if Trump doesn't back down, I think this is very much what we need to be doing. Second of all, in terms of Article 4, again, if these threats continue, I believe we should invoke Article 4, that of course should come from Greenland and Denmark, in order to have a consultation as to what to do, because it is de facto a threat to Greenland and Denmark, and therefore by extension to the rest of the alliance. So I do believe that Europe's primary approach will be negotiations, because that's how Europeans do policy and politics, negotiations, and try to, de-escalate. However, Trump is playing hardball and he respects hard power. So we need to back it up with stronger measures. And I believe, and I hope this is what European Union will do.
Lady, just to clarify for our listeners that the 93 billion which you talked about was a package of tariffs, retaliatory tariffs on US products, mostly things produced in red Republican states, such as Jack Daniels bourbon, Harley-Davidson motorbikes, and so on, which the European Union agreed in principle to apply last year and then never activated because of the trade deal, such as it was, that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, reached with President Trump last summer. So that package has not gone away and could be snapped back quite quickly. Peter, let me turn to you. What do you think? Do you think Denmark should use the NATO Treaty Article 4 and take this to NATO and say, help, I'm being mugged?
Sometimes we've talked about this as a joke, right? That we could always call the White House and ask them to, nuke it itself, right? Because we are under attack here. But, I don't see that would simply just. I don't really see that as a possibility in having any effect, as it were. When we look at how the Europeans have been, how long and slow they were to respond to Ukraine. We don't have a very strong record there. I mean, if it had not been for the American strong, vigorous response in the beginning, we probably wouldn't have to talk about Ukraine, for instance, right now, right? So NATO without America isn't NATO, and we don't have the nuclear forces at the moment. I think actually we have to think about that time is in our favor. There's a reason why Trump is now escalating things. And he's escalating many things because he knows that by the midterm election, chances are that he will, as they call it, be a lame duck for the rest of his presidency. So for the reasonable or the best strategy towards success from my perspective is to continue or show the Americans that all the things they want, they're already theirs, as we are also shown in that article. And then try to make time work in our favor. Of course, we shouldn't just kowtow, as it were. We should stand firm, but I think there's just one game that Europeans can't win over Trump, and that is what I call Twitter escalation. no one can beat Trump on Twitter. This is, he has a pretty good proven track record there. No people who normally think about these things can't understand why he could possibly be elected again, right? But he does. So he wins on Twitter. We can't win that war.
Well, one lesson that our leaders don't seem to have learned yet is that it's foolish to send Trump any communication that you think is going to remain private.
So, and actually, if you take that sort of a imperial sort of a thing seriously, as we say, I mean, the center may send out commands, right? But sometimes they're just ignored.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
We also have the right occasionally to ignore the most frivolous bluster occasionally. We don't have to jump every time he says jump, but stay first, keep a firm course and stick to our sort of positions and try to make it work out. But there could never be a war about Greenland. Europe will not have any forces to send up there to an extent that would be necessary. And also it would be completely crazy, right? America is already the military sovereign on Greenland.
So many Trump-induced crises have a way of blowing over after a short burst of sound and fury. So is that still possible over Greenland? I mean, we've heard various possible deadlines for when this might. You just mentioned the midterm elections. As if we just sit tight till the midterm elections, it'll blow over. I've heard that he wants this done before his birthday, before he turns 80 in June, when he's going to have a triumphal parade in Washington. I've heard he might want it done before the 4th of July, when the United States turns 250 years old.
And these things are very interesting, right? But on the other hand, I mean, it's just very difficult for Denmark to act on stuff like this. I mean, according to our constitution and also the deal with Greenland, right, they will have to have referenda and talk about these things, and us too. So it simply cannot be done in sort of a regular fashion, right? And what about America? Actually including Greenland somehow as a new Puerto Rico or something in America would require a constitutional process involving the Congress too. I don't think this is possible, simply.
So, bottom line, each of you, do you think Greenland will still be Danish at the end of this year and at the end of this decade? Peter?
What do you think, Maria? Do we have any chance?
I believe that Greenland and Denmark crisis is a European-wide crisis. And unless we push back and raise the stakes, then surely there is a heightened risk that we might lose Greenland and have one of the biggest political military crises in Euro-Atlantic history. Europe has been acting, as I like to say, as a cute, fluffy bunny in the world of predatory powers who are just looking for the next kill. And Europe has to recognize the current realities and reassess its actions. I think without that, we will continue being a lame duck, as you, Peter, earlier mentioned. Thank you.
Well, actually, in that respect, even though I might be a little more conciliatory than you, we actually agree on this, that actually I think it is being revealed, right, that Europe has been engaged in what the Chinese would call self-weakening. And we have now discovered that, for instance, we were so good at cashing in the peace dividend, that we are so short of hard power that we cannot balance the American supremo, as it were. We always have these sort of ideas about empires. They're just centralized and everything runs from the center, but it doesn't. All empires always depends on striking collaborative deals with locals. And that's based on a sort of bargaining and also, balance of power. And that balance of power have now become so weak because we have simply, at some point, right, we basically said in Europe, military power is sort of old-fashioned. It sort of belongs to the dusty heap of history. Whereas we forgot that law and order is based at the end of the day, it's still based on a military sovereignty, right?
I agree, Peter, that we need ideally a deal. But in order to get there, we do have to raise the stakes first.
Well, to sum up, I think you both think that Europe needs to strengthen its hand in order to achieve a negotiated outcome for Greenland, which you both believe could still leave Greenland and its current status as part of the Kingdom of Denmark and not necessarily being taken over by the United States. Well, that's all we've got time for this week, but you can read the articles I referred to and some other analyses on the Greenland crisis on the EPC's website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time with more analysis of our topsy-turvy geopolitical world. Next time we'll be looking at Donald Trump's Board of Peace and whether the Europeans should touch it with a 10-foot sterilized barge pole. Until then, thanks to our assistant Simona Lusuari for helping with the recording and production of this podcast. And above all, thanks to you for listening in and for the great feedback some of you are sending us. And bye for now.